The stage rattled into La Junta, Colorado on a blistering afternoon in July of 1878, and Eloise Donnelly clutched her carpetbag tighter against her chest as though it could shield her from what was coming next, knowing that inside the false bottom lay her most precious secret wrapped in a bundle of letters she had never sent. The dust hung thick in the air as the wheels ground to a halt outside the general store, and Eloise peered through the smudged window at the collection of weathered buildings that would now be her home. La Junta was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of sun-bleached structures crouched along the Arkansas River like animals seeking shade. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and imposing against the endless Colorado sky. She had traveled from Philadelphia, leaving behind everything she knew, trading the crowded streets and sooty factories for this wild frontier town where women were scarce and men were desperate enough to send away for brides through carefully worded advertisements. Her hands trembled as she gathered her belongings. The other passengers had already disembarked, eager to escape the cramped quarters and stretch their legs. Eloise moved slowly, deliberately, buying herself a few more moments before she had to face him. Before she had to face Brock Dalton, the cowboy whose letters had been so earnest and kind, promising her a fresh start and a good home. He did not know about Clara. How could he? Eloise had pored over his letters a dozen times, searching for some indication that he might understand, that he might accept a ready-made family. But his words spoke only of building a future together, of finding companionship in this harsh land. The baby stirred in the carpetbag, and Eloise's heart lurched. She had given Clara a few drops of chamomile tea mixed with sugar water before they arrived, just enough to keep her drowsy and quiet for a little while longer. The guilt of it sat heavy in her stomach, but what choice did she have? If Brock saw the baby immediately, if he rejected them both here at the stage stop with nowhere to go and no money to get back home, they would be ruined. "Miss Donnelly," a voice called from outside the stage, deep and hesitant. Eloise took a breath that seemed to catch in her throat. This was it. She adjusted her bonnet, smoothed down her traveling dress, though it was hopelessly wrinkled and stained with dust, and descended the steps with as much dignity as she could muster. The man standing before her was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered and sun-bronzed, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck beneath his worn hat. His eyes were a startling blue, the color of the sky just before twilight, and they regarded her with an expression that seemed equal parts nervous and hopeful. He held his hat in his hands, turning it over and over between his fingers. "Miss Donnelly?" he said again, and she could hear the question in his voice, as though he was not quite sure she was real. "Yes," Eloise managed, her voice coming out thinner than she intended. "Mr. Dalton?" "Brock," he said quickly. "Please, just Brock." He seemed to remember himself then, and stepped forward, reaching for her trunk. "Let me get your things. The wagon's just over here. I hope the journey wasn't too hard on you. I know it's a long way from Philadelphia." She watched as he hefted her trunk onto his shoulder with ease, the muscles in his arms flexing beneath his shirt. He moved with the natural grace of someone who spent his life working with his body. There was something reassuring in his capable movements. But Eloise's eyes kept darting to the carpetbag she held, feeling the weight of her daughter inside, and the fear rose up in her throat like bile. "I can carry that for you," Brock offered, gesturing to the bag. "No," Eloise said too quickly, then forced a smile. "I mean, thank you, but I would prefer to keep it with me. It has some delicate items." He nodded, not pressing the issue, and led her toward a sturdy wagon hitched to two patient horses. The wagon bed was clean, lined with fresh hay, and he had even laid out a blanket over the seat, small kindnesses that made Eloise's deception feel all the worse. As Brock loaded her trunk, Eloise glanced around the street. A few people had stopped to stare, curious about the newcomer. An older woman in a faded calico dress stood outside the mercantile, her arms crossed over her chest as she watched. Two men lounged against the hitching post outside the saloon, their eyes tracking Eloise's movements with undisguised interest. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the heat. "I thought we might stop by the church first," Brock said as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. His hand was warm and rough with calluses, and he held her elbow gently, as though she might break. "Reverend Patterson's expecting us. I figured we could get married right away if that suits you." Unless you need some time to rest first. I understand if you do. It's been a long journey. Married right away, of course. That was the arrangement. She had agreed to it in her letters, had signed her name to the promise, but now, sitting beside this stranger who smelled of leather and horses and sun-warmed cotton, Eloise felt the full weight of what she had done crashing down on her. I would prefer to wait, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Just a day or two, to get my bearings, if that is acceptable to you. Brock was quiet for a moment, and she could feel his eyes on her. When she finally gathered the courage to look at him, she found his expression thoughtful rather than angry. Of course, he said finally. That's more than reasonable. I have a small house on my property, about 3 miles outside town. It's not much, but it's clean and sturdy. There's a bedroom you can use, and I'll sleep in the barn until we're properly married. I want you to feel comfortable, Miss Donnelly. I know this is all very strange. The relief that flooded through her was so intense she felt dizzy. A day or two. That would give her time to figure out how to tell him, time to find the right words. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking beneath them as they followed the rutted road out of town. The landscape stretched out in all directions, golden grassland dotted with scrub brush and the occasional cottonwood tree. The mountains loomed larger as they traveled, and Eloise could see the dark line of the river cutting through the valley. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, so different from the cramped streets and gray buildings of Philadelphia. I raise cattle, Brock said suddenly, breaking the silence. Not a huge herd, but enough to make a living. I have about 300 head right now, and some good grazing land. The work's hard, but honest. I also break horses on the side, which brings in extra money. I won't lie to you, Miss Donnelly. Life out here isn't easy. The winters can be brutal, and there's always something needing fixing or tending. But I've built something solid here, something that could be a real home with the right person to share it. Eloise listened to the quiet pride in his voice and felt her throat tighten. He was trying so hard to reassure her, to paint a picture of the life they might have together, and she was lying to him with every breath. Why did you send for a bride? She asked, partly because she was genuinely curious and partly because she needed to shift attention away from herself. Surely there are women here in Colorado who would have been interested. Brock was quiet for a long moment, his hand steady on the reins. There are a few, he admitted, but none that felt right. I spent 3 years courting a girl in town, Sarah Mitchell. We were planning to get married, had the date set and everything. Then she met a banker from Denver who came through to assess properties for investment. She married him instead and moved away. That was 2 years ago. I am sorry, Eloise said softly, and she meant it. He shrugged, but she could see the tightness around his eyes. She made her choice. I don't blame her for wanting an easier life than what I could offer, but it made me realize that the women here, the ones looking to marry, they're mostly looking for security and comfort. Nothing wrong with that, but I wanted something different. I wanted someone who was willing to take a chance, someone who understood what it meant to start fresh. When I saw your advertisement in the newspaper, something about your words spoke to me. You wrote about wanting a new beginning, about leaving the past behind. That resonated. Eloise's chest felt tight. She had written those words in desperation, sitting in her tiny boarding house room with Clara crying in a basket beside her, and her savings dwindling to nothing. She had been so careful in her letters to Brock, revealing just enough to seem genuine while hiding the truth that would surely send him running. The baby shifted in the carpetbag, and Eloise tensed, but Clara remained quiet. The chamomile tea was still working, thank God. But it would not last much longer. What about you? Brock asked. What made you decide to come all the way out here? Your letters mentioned you worked in a factory, but not much else about your life in Philadelphia. Eloise had prepared for this question, had rehearsed her answer during the long journey west. My parents died 3 years ago, within months of each other, influenza. I had no other family, and the factory work barely paid enough to cover my room and board. Philadelphia is expensive, and I was tired of just surviving. I wanted a chance at something more. It was all true as far as it went. She just left out the part about meeting Thomas Hayes at a church social, about how his smile had made her believe in possibilities she had no business believing in, about how he had promised to marry her, right up until she told him about the baby. Then he had disappeared. taking her trust and her innocence with him, leaving her alone and pregnant and facing a future that grew darker with each passing day. "That takes courage," Brock said, and there was admiration in his voice. "Coming out here alone, not knowing what you would find. I respect that." The guilt twisted deeper, and Eloise had to look away, blinking back the sudden sting of tears. She did not feel courageous. She felt like a fraud and a coward. The house came into view as they crested a small rise. It was a simple structure, built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. The roof looked sturdy, newly patched, and there was a small covered porch across the front. Behind the house stood a barn and several outbuildings, all in good repair. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass, and Eloise could hear the burble of water from somewhere nearby. "There's a creek that runs through the property," Brock said, following her gaze. "Never runs dry, even in the hottest summers. That was one of the reasons I bought this land. Good water's worth more than gold out here." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, then came around to help Eloise descend. She clutched the carpetbag tightly, feeling Clara's weight shift inside. The baby would wake soon, and then there would be no more hiding. "Let me show you inside," Brock said, carrying her trunk up the porch steps. The interior of the house was dim after the bright sunlight, and Eloise's eyes took a moment to adjust. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. The furniture was simple but well made: a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the fireplace, shelves lined with books and supplies. Everything was neat and orderly, though it had the sparse quality of a space inhabited by someone who lived alone. "The bedroom's through here," Brock said, pushing open a door to reveal a small room with a bed, a dresser, and a washstand. "I put fresh linens on the bed yesterday, and there's water in the pitcher. I'll bring in your trunk." Eloise stood in the middle of the bedroom, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. This was the moment. She could hear Brock setting down her trunk in the main room, could hear his footsteps as he moved around. Soon he would leave her to settle in, and then Clara would wake, and her crying would carry through these thin walls, and everything would come crashing down, unless she told him first, unless she controlled how he found out. Eloise set the carpetbag on the bed and carefully opened it. Clara lay inside, swaddled in a soft blanket, her tiny face peaceful in sleep. She was 3 months old, with downy dark hair and skin that had finally lost its newborn redness. She was beautiful and perfect, and Eloise loved her with a fierceness that sometimes frightened her. She gathered Clara into her arms, feeling the comforting weight of her daughter, and walked back out into the main room. Brock was standing by the table, pouring water from a jug into a glass. He looked up as she entered, a smile already forming on his lips, and then he saw what she was carrying. The smile froze, then slowly faded. The glass in his hand trembled slightly, water sloshing over the rim. "Miss Donnelly?" His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the confusion and dawning realization in his eyes. "Her name is Clara," Eloise said, and her voice shook despite her efforts to keep it steady. "She is 3 months old. She is my daughter." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Brock set the glass down on the table with exaggerated care, then stood there, staring at the baby in Eloise's arms. His face had gone pale beneath his tan, and a muscle worked in his jaw. "You did not mention a child in your letters," he said finally. "I know." Eloise's arms tightened around Clara. "I should have. I wanted to, but I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" His voice was rising now, the first hint of anger creeping in. "Afraid that I might have said no? Afraid that I might have wanted to know the truth before I sent money for your passage and made arrangements with the Reverend and told the whole town I was getting married?" "Yes," Eloise said simply, because there was no point in denying it. "I was afraid of exactly that, because every other option I had was worse. I had no money, no family, no way to support myself and a baby in Philadelphia. The factory would not take me back once they knew I had a child. The boarding house was going to evict me. I was desperate, Mr. Dalton. And you seemed kind in your letters. I thought perhaps, if you got to know me first, if we had a chance to meet, you might understand." "Understand?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Understand that you lied to me? That everything in your letters was designed to deceive me?" Not everything, Eloise said, and now her own anger was rising, fueled by fear and exhaustion and the bone-deep weariness of months spent fighting just to survive. Everything I wrote about wanting a new start was true. Everything about wanting to build a life was true. The only thing I left out was Clara, and yes, that was wrong. But I'm not going to apologize for doing whatever I had to do to protect my daughter. Clara chose that moment to wake, her small face scrunching up as she began to fuss. Eloise bounced her gently, making soft shushing sounds, but the baby was hungry and would not be easily soothed. Brock watched them, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away, walking to the window and staring out at the land beyond. His shoulders were tense, his hands clenched at his sides. "Where is her father?" he asked, not looking at Eloise. "Gone," Eloise said flatly. "He wanted nothing to do with us once he learned I was pregnant. He promised marriage and then vanished. I've not seen or heard from him since I told him about the baby." Another long silence. Clara's fussing grew louder, building toward a full cry, and Eloise felt the familiar panic rising. She needed to feed the baby, but she could not do that here, not with Brock standing there looking at her like she had betrayed him, which, she supposed, she had. "I need to tend to her," Eloise said quietly. "With your permission, I will take her into the bedroom." Brock nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head, still not looking at her. Eloise fled into the bedroom and closed the door behind her, then sank onto the bed and loosened her dress to let Clara nurse. The baby latched on eagerly, and Eloise felt tears streaming down her face, though she made no sound. She had known this moment would come. She had tried to prepare herself for his anger, for his rejection. But actually, living through it was so much harder than she had imagined. She heard the front door open and close. Through the small window, she saw Brock striding toward the barn, his movements sharp and angry. He disappeared inside, and Eloise let herself cry properly then, great shaking sobs that she muffled against Clara's blanket. What had she done? She had come all this way, had risked everything on the hope that somehow it might work out, and now she was stranded in the middle of Colorado with no money and a 3-month-old baby and a man who looked at her like she was a liar and a cheat. Because that was exactly what she was. Clara finished nursing and fell back asleep, content and oblivious to the disaster unfolding around her. Eloise changed her diaper, using supplies from her trunk, then laid her gently in the center of the bed, surrounded by pillows so she could not roll off. Then she sat in the room's single chair and stared at the wall, trying to think of what to do next. The light outside shifted from bright afternoon to the softer gold of early evening. Eloise heard movement in the main room, heard the clink of dishes and the crackle of a fire being built. After a while, there was a soft knock on the bedroom door. "Miss Donnelly," Brock's voice carefully controlled, "I have made some food. You should eat." Eloise stood and opened the door. Brock stood on the other side, and she could see he had washed his face and hands, had tried to compose himself, but his eyes were still wary and he kept his distance. "Thank you," she said quietly. On the table, he had laid out a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread. There was fresh milk in a pitcher and coffee in a pot on the stove. They sat across from each other, the silence heavy between them, and ate without speaking. Finally, Brock set down his fork and looked at her directly. "I need time to think about this," he said. "I'm not going to throw you out. You and the baby can stay here tonight, and we will figure out what to do in the morning. But I cannot make any promises beyond that. You have to understand, this changes everything." "I do understand," Eloise said, "and I am grateful for your kindness, even now." He nodded, then stood and cleared his plate. "I will be in the barn if you need anything. Make yourself at home. There's more wood for the fire stacked outside, and help yourself to anything in the kitchen." Then he was gone, leaving Eloise alone in the quiet house with her sleeping daughter and the wreckage of her hopes. She cleaned up from dinner, then checked on Clara, who was still sleeping peacefully. The house grew dark, and Eloise lit a lamp, the soft glow pushing back the shadows. She sat in the rocking chair by the fireplace and let herself rock slowly back and forth, the motion soothing something deep inside her. She must have dozed off because she woke to the sound of Clara crying. Disoriented, Eloise stumbled to the bedroom and picked up her daughter, soothing her and checking her diaper. The baby was wet, and Eloise changed her quickly, then settled back on the bed to nurse her again. The house was completely dark now, except for the lamp she had left burning in the main room Through the window, she could see a faint light in the barn. Brock was still out there, choosing to sleep with the horses rather than share space with her. The knowledge hurt more than she wanted to admit. The next day dawned clear and hot. Eloise woke early, her body clock still adjusted to factory hours, and found Brock already in the kitchen, making coffee. He nodded to her but said nothing, and Eloise busied herself with tending to Clara, changing her and dressing her in a fresh gown. "I need to ride out and check on the herd," Brock said as Eloise emerged from the bedroom with the baby. "I will be gone most of the day. There's food in the pantry. I ask that you not leave the property. It is not safe for a woman alone out here." "I understand," Eloise said, though the request felt more like being told she was a prisoner. He left without another word, and Eloise spent the day exploring her new surroundings. The house was well stocked, she discovered, with jars of preserves and sacks of flour and cornmeal, dried beans and salted meat. Brock clearly knew how to take care of himself. She found cleaning supplies and set about tidying the house, partly because it needed doing and partly because she needed something to occupy her hands and mind. Clara was fussy that day, perhaps sensing her mother's distress, and Eloise spent a good deal of time walking her around the house, bouncing her and singing soft songs. She ventured onto the porch and stood in the shade, looking out at the vast landscape. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, this wild land that was now supposed to be her home. Brock returned near sunset, dusty and tired. He washed up at the pump outside, then came in to find Eloise had made dinner using supplies from his pantry, stew with vegetables from his small garden plot and fresh biscuits. He looked surprised but said nothing, just sat down and ate. This pattern continued for 3 days. Brock would leave at dawn and return at sunset. They would eat together in silence, and then he would retreat to the barn. Eloise felt the weight of his consideration pressing down on her. He was trying to decide what to do with her, and she had no power to influence that decision except to wait. On the 4th day, Brock did not leave at dawn. Instead, he sat at the table with his coffee and watched as Eloise moved around the kitchen with Clara on her hip, preparing breakfast. "Sit down," he said finally. "We need to talk." Eloise's stomach clenched, but she settled Clara in the wooden cradle that Brock had brought in from the barn the day before, another silent kindness that had given her a sliver of hope. Then she sat across from him and waited. "I have been thinking," Brock said slowly, choosing his words with care, "about what you said, about being desperate and doing what you had to do to protect your daughter. I have been angry, and I think I have a right to be. You did lie to me. But I have also been trying to understand why." Eloise said nothing, afraid to interrupt. "I had a sister," Brock continued, his eyes distant, "younger than me. When she was 17, she fell in love with a ranch hand. He promised to marry her, and she believed him. When she got pregnant, he ran off. My father was a hard man, religious and unforgiving. He threw her out of the house, said she had shamed the family. I was only 19 myself, working on a ranch 3 counties over, and I did not find out until it was too late. She tried to make it on her own, but it was winter, and she had no money and nowhere to go. They found her body in an abandoned line shack 2 months later. She and the baby both froze to death." Eloise felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Brock's jaw tightened, and she saw him blink hard. "I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help someone in that situation, I would, that I would not be like my father, so caught up in pride and righteousness that I would let someone suffer. So here is what I am thinking. I brought you out here to be my wife, and that is still what I want. But I understand if you need time, and I understand that things are more complicated now." He took a breath, then met her eyes directly. "I will love you both," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. "If you are willing to try. If you are willing to be honest with me from now on. I will marry you and I will claim Clara as my own. She will have my name and my protection. I will raise her as my daughter, and any other children we might have will be her brothers and sisters. But I need your word that there will be no more secrets, no more lies. If we are going to build a life together, it has to be built on trust." Eloise could not speak. The words she wanted to say stuck in her throat, tangled up with relief and gratitude and something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Why?" she finally managed. Why would you do this? Because everyone deserves a second chance, Brock said simply. Because I understand what it means to be desperate, and because when I look at you with that baby, I see someone who is fighting with everything she has to do right by her child. That is the kind of person I want as a partner in this life, someone who does not give up. Eloise felt the tears spill over, running down her cheeks. I promise, she said, her voice breaking. No more secrets, no more lies, I promise. Brock nodded, then stood. Then we will ride into town this afternoon and speak to Reverend Patterson, if you are willing. I am willing, Eloise said. They were married that evening in the small church in La Junta, with the Reverend's wife and the general store owner serving as witnesses. Eloise wore her best dress, slightly rumpled from the trunk but clean, and she held Clara in her arms throughout the brief ceremony. Brock stood beside her, tall and solid, and when he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, his hand was steady. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Patterson intoned. You may kiss your bride. Brock leaned down and pressed a chaste kiss to Eloise's lips, brief and formal, and she wondered what he was thinking. If he regretted this decision already, if he would come to resent her and Clara for trapping him into this arrangement. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Clara slept in Eloise's arms, and Brock was quiet beside her, the reins loose in his hands as the horses plodded along the familiar path home. When they arrived, Brock helped Eloise down from the wagon, then carried Clara's cradle into the house while Eloise followed with the baby. Inside, he set the cradle in the bedroom, then turned to face her. I meant what I said, he told her, about raising Clara as my own. But I also meant what I said about trust. This marriage, it is not just a piece of paper to me. I want it to be real. But that will take time, and I understand that. What are you saying? Eloise asked, confused. I'm saying that you can have the bedroom for as long as you need it, Brock said. I will not rush you into anything you are not ready for. When you feel comfortable, when you feel like you can trust me, then we can talk about what comes next. Until then, I will sleep out here. Eloise felt a rush of emotion that she could not quite name. Relief, certainly, but also a strange disappointment. That's very considerate, she said quietly. Thank you. He nodded, then moved past her to gather blankets from a chest. I will see you in the morning. Sleep well, Eloise. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips sent a small shiver through her. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Brock would rise before dawn and do his chores, then come in for breakfast that Eloise prepared. They would eat together, speaking of small things, the weather and the cattle and the news from town. Then, Brock would ride out to work his land, and Eloise would spend the day caring for Clara and managing the house. She threw herself into the work, discovering a satisfaction in keeping things clean and orderly, in cooking meals that Brock ate with obvious appreciation. She started a garden, expanding the small plot Brock had maintained, and spent afternoons weeding and watering while Clara dozed in the shade of the porch. The work was hard, but it was honest, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eloise felt like she was building something rather than just surviving. Brock, for his part, was unfailingly kind but kept a careful distance. He never pushed her, never demanded anything beyond simple companionship. But Eloise began to notice things about him, the way he would carve small toys out of scrap wood in the evenings and leave them by Clara's cradle, the way he made sure there was always hot water ready when she needed to bathe the baby, the way he looked at Clara sometimes, with a softness in his eyes that made Eloise's heart ache. One evening, about 2 weeks after the wedding, Eloise was struggling to soothe a colicky Clara while trying to finish preparing dinner. The baby was screaming, her face red and angry, and nothing Eloise did seemed to help. Brock came in from his evening chores, took one look at the situation, and simply held out his arms. "May I?" he asked. Eloise hesitated, then handed over the baby. She expected Clara to scream louder, confronted with an unfamiliar person, but instead, the baby seemed startled into quiet. Brock held her against his chest, one large hand supporting her head, and began to walk slowly around the room, swaying slightly with each step. He hummed tunelessly, a low rumbling sound, and after a few minutes, Clara's cries subsided into hiccuping whimpers, then silence. Eloise stood at the stove, watching this man who had every reason to resent her daughter, but instead was soothing her with such patient gentleness. Something in her chest cracked open, and she had to turn away, blinking back tears. "She just needed to be walked," Brock said quietly, still swaying. "My sister used to get fussy like this. Ma said some babies just need motion." "Thank you," Eloise managed. "I did not know you had experience with babies." "Not much," Brock admitted, "but I remember some things. She is a good baby, Eloise. You have done well with her." The praise, simple as it was, meant more than he could know. Eloise dished up dinner, and Brock sat at the table with Clara still in his arms, eating one-handed while the baby dozed against his chest. After that, something shifted between them. It was subtle, a gradual easing of the tension that had kept them circling each other like wary animals. They began to talk more freely, sharing stories of their pasts. Brock told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the restlessness that had driven him north to Colorado to make his own way. Eloise told him about her parents, about her mother who had worked as a seamstress and taught Eloise to sew, about her father who had been a clerk and loved to read, about how their deaths had left her adrift in a city that suddenly felt hostile and uncaring. She told him about Thomas, haltingly at first, but Brock listened without judgment. "He was handsome and charming," Eloise said, "and I was lonely and naive. He made me feel special, like I mattered. By the time I realized he was not the man he pretended to be, it was too late." "That was not your fault," Brock said firmly. "He took advantage of you. That is on him, not you." The simple absolution made Eloise want to cry again. She had carried so much shame for so long, convinced that she had brought her troubles on herself through weakness and foolishness. To have someone tell her otherwise, to have someone see her as a victim rather than a sinner, was a gift beyond measure. Summer deepened into August, and the days grew hotter and longer. Eloise adapted to the rhythms of ranch life, learning to read the weather in the shape of clouds on the horizon, learning to listen for the sounds that meant trouble with the stock or predators near the henhouse Brock had built for her. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental oven, to churn butter, to preserve vegetables from the garden. Clara grew and thrived, her cheeks filling out and her smiles becoming more frequent. She began to recognize Brock, her face lighting up when he came in from working, her little arms reaching for him. And Brock, gruff and reserved as he could be, melted like snow in spring when she smiled at him. One evening in late August, after Clara had been put to bed and they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Brock reached over and took Eloise's hand. It was the first time he had touched her since the chaste kiss at their wedding, and Eloise felt her breath catch. "I know we have not talked about it," Brock said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, "but I want you to know that I am happy you are here, both of you. This feels like home now, in a way it never did when I was alone." Eloise turned to look at him, at this man who had taken her in despite her deception, who had loved her daughter as his own without hesitation. In the golden light of sunset, his face was open and honest, and she realized with a start that what she felt for him was not just gratitude, it was something deeper, something that had been growing quietly in the space between them all these weeks. "I am happy too," she said softly. "Happier than I thought I could be." He smiled then, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and squeezed her hand gently before letting it go. That night, after they had both gone to their separate sleeping spaces, Eloise lay awake in the bedroom and thought about her husband, about the way his hands were gentle with Clara despite their calluses and scars, about the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching with an expression that made her skin feel warm, about the careful distance he maintained, waiting for her to be ready. She thought she might be ready. The next morning, Eloise made breakfast as usual, but when Brock came in from his chores, she stopped him before he could sit down. "I was thinking," she said, her heart pounding, "the bedroom is large enough for the cradle and a full bed, and you have been sleeping on the floor out here for almost 2 months now. That cannot be comfortable." Brock went very still, his eyes searching her face. "Eloise, I do not want you to feel pressured." "I do not," she said quickly. "I feel the opposite. I feel like I have been unfair, asking you to wait when you have already been so patient and kind. You are my husband, Brock. I would like to start acting like it." The hope that flared in his eyes made her chest tight. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Eloise said, and realized as she spoke the words that they were true. That night, Brock moved his belongings into the bedroom. They lay together in the bed with Clara's cradle nearby, and Brock held Eloise carefully as though she might break. She turned in his arms and kissed him, properly this time, and felt him respond with a hunger that he had clearly been holding back for weeks. Their lovemaking was slow and gentle, Brock taking his time to learn what made her gasp and sigh, always checking to make sure she was comfortable, that she wanted this. It was nothing like her fumbling encounters with Thomas, hasty and tinged with guilt. This felt like something sacred, a true joining, and when it was over, Eloise lay in her husband's arms and felt tears slip down her temples. "Did I hurt you?" Brock asked immediately, his voice concerned. "No," Eloise said, smiling through her tears. "No, you were perfect. I'm just happy." He kissed her forehead and pulled her closer, and she fell asleep, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Autumn came to Colorado with a riot of gold and red in the cottonwoods along the river. Brock and Eloise settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. They worked together in comfortable partnership, Brock handling the heavy outdoor labor while Eloise managed the house and helped where she could. She learned to milk the cow he bought, to collect eggs from the chickens, to help him sort and count cattle when he brought them in close to the homestead. Clara continued to grow, becoming more active and alert. She would sit propped on blankets on the porch and watch them work, her dark eyes tracking their movements. Brock doted on her shamelessly, making faces to earn her laughter, carrying her in a sling Eloise fashioned so he could have her with him while he did light chores around the homestead. In October, Brock took Eloise and Clara into town for the harvest dance. It was a social event for the entire community, held in the barn behind the church, and Eloise was nervous about how she would be received. She was the outsider, the mail order bride, and she knew there had been talk. But Brock kept his arm around her waist as they entered. Clara perched on his other hip and introduced her to everyone with quiet pride. "This is my wife, Eloise, and our daughter Clara," he would say, and the way he claimed them both made Eloise fall a little more in love with him each time. Most people were welcoming, curious about the newcomer, but friendly. The Reverend's wife, Mrs. Patterson, was particularly kind, cooing over Clara and inviting Eloise to the ladies' quilting circle that met every Thursday. A few women were cooler, regarding Eloise with suspicion or barely concealed judgment, but she held her head high and stayed close to Brock, drawing strength from his steady presence. They danced that night, Brock surprisingly graceful for such a large man, and Eloise felt young and carefree in a way she had not since before her parents died. Clara slept in a basket nearby, watched over by the older women who clucked over her like hens with a particularly precious chick. And for a few hours, Eloise let herself simply enjoy being with her husband. On the ride home, with Clara asleep in her arms and the stars brilliant overhead, Brock said, "You looked beautiful tonight." Eloise leaned against his shoulder. "I had a wonderful time. Thank you for taking us." "Thank you for coming with me," Brock said, "for choosing to stay even when I gave you reason to doubt. I know I was not exactly welcoming when you first arrived." "You had every right to be angry," Eloise said. "I lied to you." "You did what you had to do to survive," Brock corrected. "I understand that now. I'm just grateful that you ended up here, with me." Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in mid-November. Brock had prepared well, stockpiling hay and grain for the animals, making sure the house was properly chinked and insulated. He brought the cattle down from the high pastures and kept them close, checking on them daily despite the bitter cold. Eloise learned to bake bread that could withstand being frozen solid, then thawed and reheated. She knitted socks and scarves and a blanket for Clara, her fingers flying through the long dark evenings while Brock worked on tack repair or read aloud from one of his books. They were snowed in for days at a time, the world beyond the windows a swirling white blank. But inside the house it was warm and bright and full. Clara had her first Christmas, though she was too young to understand it. Brock carved her a rattle and a small horse, the details painstakingly perfect, and Eloise sewed her a new dress from fabric she had been saving. They attended Christmas service in town, the sleigh ride through the snow magical and crystalline, and sang carols with voices that echoed in the cold air. On Christmas night, after Clara was asleep, Brock gave Eloise a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a cameo brooch, delicate and beautiful, with a woman's profile carved in ivory against an onyx background. "It was my mother's," Brock said quietly. One of the few things I kept after she died. I would like you to have it." Eloise felt tears prick her eyes as she fastened it to her dress. "I will treasure it always." "I have something else for you," Brock said, suddenly awkward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "I had some legal papers drawn up, adoption papers for Clara, making her officially mine in the eyes of the law. I need you to sign them too, since you are her mother. But I wanted to do this properly, to make sure she is protected no matter what." Eloise's hands shook as she unfolded the papers and read them. "Brock, I do not know what to say." "Say yes," he said simply. "Let me give her my name in truth. Let me be her father, not just in our hearts, but in the world." "Yes," Eloise whispered. "Yes, of course, yes." They signed the papers together by lamplight, witnessed by their own signatures, and Brock promised to file them with the county clerk when the roads cleared. Then he pulled Eloise into his arms and kissed her, until she forgot the cold and the snow and everything beyond the warm circle of his embrace. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, the snow melting in fits and starts. By April, the high pastures were greening up, and Brock began the work of moving the cattle back to their summer grazing land. It was hard, exhausting work, and he was gone for days at a time, camping out with the herd to protect them from predators and guide them safely. Eloise managed the homestead in his absence, surprised by her own competence. She fed the chickens and collected eggs, milked the cow, kept the house running smoothly. Clara was crawling now, getting into everything, and Eloise spent her days chasing after her daughter and marveling at how much their lives had changed. When Brock returned from one of his longer trips, dusty and exhausted, he found the house spotless, a hot meal waiting, and Eloise greeting him with a kiss that held genuine joy. She had been lonely without him, had missed his quiet presence and steady companionship. He had become essential to her, she realized, as necessary as breath. That night, after they had made love and lay tangled together in the darkness, Eloise gathered her courage and said, "I love you." She felt Brock go still beside her, then his arms tightened around her. "Say that again," he said, his voice rough. "I love you," Eloise repeated, stronger this time. "I think I have for a while now. I just was not sure if you wanted to hear it." "Wanted to hear it?" Brock laughed, a sound of pure relief. "Eloise, I have loved you since the day you walked out of that bedroom holding Clara and admitted the truth to me. I loved your courage and your fierceness and your refusal to apologize for protecting your child. I have just been afraid to tell you, afraid you only stayed with me because you had no choice." "I stayed because I wanted to," Eloise said, turning to face him in the darkness. "Because you showed me what kindness looks like, what real love looks like. You saved us, Brock, in every way that matters." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and showed her with his body what his words could not quite express. Later, as they lay in the drowsy aftermath, Brock said, "I would like more children, if you are willing. Brothers and sisters for Clara." "I would like that too," Eloise said, imagining their family growing, imagining children with Brock's blue eyes and her dark hair running through these fields. "Very much." Summer arrived in full force, hot and bright. Eloise's garden flourished, and she spent long hours preserving vegetables for the coming winter. Clara took her first steps in July, wobbling across the kitchen floor into Brock's waiting arms, and they both cheered as though she had accomplished some great feat. In August, Eloise realized she had missed her monthly courses. The familiar signs were there, the tender breasts and waves of nausea, and when she told Brock, his whoop of joy could probably be heard all the way in town. He picked her up and spun her around, then set her down carefully as though she might break. "Are you happy?" he asked, his hands on her stomach as though he could already feel the life growing there. "I am so happy," Eloise said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The pregnancy was easier than her first had been, perhaps because she was not facing it alone and terrified. Brock fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest, taking on more of the household chores himself. The women of the town, hearing the news, began to visit more often, bringing baby clothes and advice and casseroles. Mrs. Patterson became a particular friend, motherly and practical, helping Eloise prepare for the birth. Clara adjusted to being a big sister with toddler aplomb, patting Eloise's growing belly and babbling to the baby. Brock talked to the baby too, telling it stories in the evenings, his deep voice rumbling through Eloise's skin. The baby came in March of 1880, another early spring storm howling outside while Eloise labored in the bedroom. Mrs. Patterson attended as midwife, calm and efficient, and Brock paced in the main room, wearing a track in the floor. When the baby finally emerged, squalling and healthy, Mrs. Patterson called him in. "You have a son," she said, beaming. Brock stared down at the tiny red-faced infant in Eloise's arms, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "A son," he repeated wonderingly. "What should we call him?" Eloise asked, exhausted but jubilant. "What about William?" Brock suggested. "After your father." Eloise's heart swelled. She had told him so many stories about her parents, and that he remembered and wanted to honor them meant everything. "William Dalton. It is perfect." Clara was allowed in to meet her brother, and she regarded him with solemn curiosity, poking gently at his tiny fist. "Baby," she pronounced clearly, one of her handful of words. "That's right," Brock said, lifting her up so she could see better. "Your baby brother. We are all going to take care of him together." The years that followed were full and rich. William grew into a sturdy, cheerful boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. Clara adored him, mothering him constantly, and the two of them became inseparable companions. 2 more children followed, a daughter named Margaret they called Maggie in 1882, and another son, James, in 1884. The ranch prospered under Brock's careful management. He expanded the herd, bought more land, built additions onto the house to accommodate their growing family. Eloise threw herself into community life, joining the quilting circle, helping organize church socials, becoming known for her generosity and her capable hands. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Eloise would think about the terrified woman who had stepped off the stage in La Junta all those years ago, clutching a carpetbag that held all her worldly possessions and a secret she was sure would destroy her. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life entirely. One evening in the summer of 1886, Eloise stood on the porch watching her children play in the yard. Clara was 12 now, tall and graceful, helping William chase Maggie and James in some complicated game of their own invention. Brock came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How lucky I am," Eloise said simply. "How different my life might have been if you had turned me away that first day. If you had been a different kind of man." "I was the lucky one," Brock said, turning her to face him. "You and Clara, you saved me just as much as I saved you. I was so lonely before you came. I had a house, but not a home. You gave me that. You gave me everything." Eloise kissed him, still feeling that flutter in her chest that she got whenever he looked at her with love in his eyes. "I will love you both," she quoted softly. "That is what you said to me. That is what you promised." "And I kept that promise," Brock said, "every single day." "You did more than keep it," Eloise said. "You gave us a life beyond anything I could have imagined. You gave us a family. You gave us love." That night, after the children were all tucked into bed and the house was quiet, Brock and Eloise lay together in the darkness and talked about the future. About William learning to run the ranch, about Clara's interest in teaching, about all the possibilities that stretched ahead of them. "Do you ever regret it?" Brock asked suddenly. "Coming all the way out here, marrying a stranger?" "Not for one single moment," Eloise said firmly. "You are not a stranger. You are my husband, my partner, the love of my life. This is where I was always meant to be." The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Clara grew into a beautiful young woman who became a schoolteacher in town, marrying a kind young rancher in 1892 and giving Eloise and Brock their first grandchild in 1893. William took over more of the ranch operations, working alongside his father with pride and dedication. Maggie showed an aptitude for healing and became the town's unofficial nurse, assisting the doctor with everything from births to broken bones. James, the baby, inherited his father's gift with horses and started a successful horse breeding operation on a portion of the ranch land. Through it all, Brock and Eloise remained the center, the foundation upon which their family was built. They grew older together, their dark hair silvering, their faces lining with the marks of years spent in wind and sun. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened, mellowing into something rich and complex, layered with decades of shared experience. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1898, Brock took Eloise back to La Junta, to the very spot where he had first met her at the stage stop. The town had grown and changed, but the memories were still vivid. "I was so scared that day," Eloise said, looking around, "so certain everything was about to fall apart." "I was terrified too," Brock admitted. "I kept thinking, what if she takes one look at me and gets right back on that stage? What if I have made a terrible mistake?" "Some mistakes turn out to be blessings," Eloise said, taking his hand. They renewed their vows that evening, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, with Reverend Patterson's successor officiating. It was a simple ceremony, much like their first wedding, but infinitely more joyful. When Brock slipped a new ring onto Eloise's finger, adding to the simple gold band he had given her 20 years before, she saw the shine of tears in his eyes. "I will love you both," he said again, the words that had changed everything, "for the rest of my life and beyond." "We love you too," Eloise said, her voice strong and sure. "All of us. You are the heart of this family, Brock Dalton. You always have been." The party that followed was boisterous and happy, with music and dancing and enough food to feed half the county. Clara danced with her father, William with his mother, and all the grandchildren ran wild in the fading summer light. Eloise watched it all with deep satisfaction, this family she had built from desperation and deception, from fear and courage and unexpected grace. Later, much later, when everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Brock and Eloise sat on their porch and watched the stars emerge. The same stars that had shone down on them 20 years ago when they were strangers bound by paper promises and desperate need. The same stars that had witnessed every moment of their journey from awkward alliance to deep and abiding love. "Thank you," Eloise said softly, "for seeing past my lies to the truth underneath, for choosing us when you had every reason not to, for being the man you are." "Thank you for getting on that stage," Brock said, "for being brave enough to take a chance on a stranger, for giving me the greatest gift of my life." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, as the night deepened around them. Inside the house, their children slept safe and warm. In town, their grandchildren dreamed their own dreams. The ranch spread out around them, hundreds of acres of land they had worked and loved and built into something lasting. It was not the life Eloise had imagined for herself all those years ago in Philadelphia, working in a factory and dreaming small, cautious dreams. It was so much more. It was a life of hard work and honest sweat, of love earned and freely given, of second chances transformed into lasting happiness. As they finally rose to go inside, Brock paused to kiss his wife, the same way he had kissed her thousands of times before, and would kiss her thousands of times more. And Eloise kissed him back, tasting in that kiss everything they had built together, everything they had overcome, everything they still had to look forward to. The mail-order bride with a baby she had hidden in her carpetbag had found her home at last in the arms of the cowboy who had said, "I will love you both," and meant it with every fiber of his being. It was a promise kept, a life fully lived, a love that would endure for all their days and far beyond, woven into the very fabric of the land they had made their own and the family they had built together beneath the wide Colorado sky.